it made the transformation from strictly utilitarian to artistic. So in the earlier slide we mentioned Peking, Homo erectus is an example of Homo erectus. There's a site about 30 kilometers southwest of Peking, of Beijing, called Zhoukou, and they have a huge repository of fossils of many, many ages. And Peking man, of course, is very famous. And 700,000 years ago, it's still quite different from us. On the other hand, when we go back to Africa to about 160,000 years ago, you have skulls which are essentially modern. Tim White, my friend at Berkeley, who was heading this expedition, he would say, somebody with that skull opened that door and walked in, we would not be terribly surprised. Essentially modern in skeletal structure. So these creatures are called AMH, anatomically modern humans, about 100 to 200,000 years ago. And the excavation at Hertel was actually quite rich. Lots of adults, even children's skulls. So given this kind of a fossil record, we can see step by step how our brain grew. Lucy, about 3 million years ago, had a brain cranial capacity of about 300, 400 cc's. And the Australopithecines diverged quite a bit from each other, covered a long time span, but their brain volume did not increase very much. But by the time Homo came around, it's already around 1,000 cc's. And here we are, 1,400 cc's or thereabouts. So given a much enlarged brain, coupled with an ever more powerful method of communicating, cultural evolution became the leading force in human evolution. Nurture has overtaken nature. Nature and nurture always work together. But when culture is weak, it's largely nature. But when culture has become very, very strong, it overtakes nature. Cultural change is immensely faster than biological change in the amount of information that can be accumulated and transmitted across space, across time. Compare the biology producing wings if you want to fly, and culture producing flying machines. One took millions of years, the other took centuries. And groups of anatomically modern humans, AMH, left Africa and started to populate the world 100,000 years ago, using Asia as a way station. So biology and culture are always propelling the co-evolution. Through bipedal posture, enlarged brain, etc., natural selection provided us with the bodily machinery for language. For speaking, this includes fine control of respiration, phonation, articulation. And for understanding, this includes perceptual processes which extract invariance from background noise and analyze the input in terms of words, constructions for their semantic and pragmatic content. This morning I heard a very insightful lecture from America in this general area. Human communication was driven by ever-increasing demands as small kinship tribes with only dozens of members grew to larger and larger social political states comprising millions. A language needs to communicate not only about the changing physical environment, but also about emotions, social relations that were becoming ever increasing in variety and complexity. So that the Bao book, Chimpanzee Politics, gives a good idea of an embryonic tribal politics, which sometimes is much, much more difficult to deal with than the physical environment. So here are some of the cultural achievements. Okay. Here's a picture of the cave at Shobe, taken in 1944, and many of the creations of our ancestors date back 35,000 years, including, for instance, cave paintings. Okay. Here are some lion heads where the painting actually makes good use of the relief of the cave wall. Here's a burial site showing all sorts of pollen, showing an awareness of afterlife. Here's a bone flute showing there was music that far back, 30,000, 40,000 years back. And people did not live just for survival. Art came into the picture, including sculpture like this, flutes like this. These are too broken up to be played. But a few years ago in China, in a region called Jiahu, is discovered whole sets of flutes like this, with holes drilled in the right places for either pentatonic scale or diatonic scale. And if you log into this website, there are audio files that you can download and hear these flutes play, flutes that date back 10,000 years. So what can we say about the migration history when these people first populated continent after another continent? Well, actually, when I was still at Berkeley, there was a graduate student in the anthropology department called Rebecca Kahn. She went around to the hospitals in the San Francisco Bay Area, in Oakland, in Berkeley, in San Francisco, Daly City, and so on, collecting placenta. She collected these placenta in order to analyze the mitochondrial DNA that's in the placenta. Mitochondrial DNA, you might recall, is not nuclear, it's outside of the nucleus in the cell, and it's transmitted down the maternal line. So if you can have some DNA that's uniparental, going down one parental line, rather than both parental lines, then you can construct a family tree. And this is what she did. So Becky Mark-Stumke, who's now at Leipzig, and their teacher, Alan Wilson, constructed this very famous tree. It looks like an ark, but it's actually a tree. Here's the root. Here's the first bifurcation. Later bifurcation, and so on. She had about 140 placentas from which she constructed this tree. She organized these placenta according to the ethnic origin of the mother. Some were African, some were Asian, some from New Guinea, some from Europe, and so on. And once you check this tree against the ethnic origin, then it's strikingly clear that these are all of African descent. This is the first genetic suggestion of the out of Africa hypothesis. Left Africa and went and populated the world. Of course, this was mitochondrial DNA, doesn't have too much genetic information, and that's just the maternal line. Once this was in the air, many laboratories began to do it with the Y chromosome, which goes down the father's side, the paternal line, also uniparental. So, for instance, down at Stanford, I have a very good friend there then, who now retired, who was in there, called Luca Cavalli-Sforza. This is done from Cavalli-Sforza's lab, using the Y chromosome, and essentially have the same story. All of African descent. The first application. And of course, with the Y chromosome, you have much richer detail. So Cavalli-Sforza and a younger colleague of his, Mark Feldman, published this nice paper in Nature Genetics in 2003, based on the genetic evidence. What can we say about the out of Africa population colonizing the world? So in that time, they had people live in Africa about 100,000 years ago, going to Asia, from Asia going to Europe, going to Australia, going to the Americas, with approximately these dates. And Cavalli-Sforza, in a later paper, in an earlier paper in PNAS, said, well, it would be nice if instead of just genetic information, we also have information from other disciplines. Cavalli-Sforza was always very enthusiastic for multidisciplinary research. And so he put together a genetic tree of the populations that he had samples on, side by side with a linguistic tree. This is the classification that some linguists use for the languages of the world. Peoples of the world, languages of the world. Just eyeballing like this, of course, it's difficult to know how significant the correlation is. But they've done all sorts of fancy mathematics, and the correlation is significant. And it's not surprising, you would want to have children with somebody that you can talk with. So genes and languages typically go together. But there are, of course, exceptions. When you get conquered by another people, you adopt their language, or the language dies because the people did not survive and so on. But nonetheless, this is a very good first shot at bringing together genetics, linguistics, and archaeology. That was the title of their paper in PNAS, trying to understand human evolution through genetics, linguistics, and archaeology. For linguistics, they were very fortunate because there was also an eminent linguist there at Stanford University, whose name is Joseph Greenberg. There's a picture of Joseph Greenberg. Also happens to be my first teacher in linguistics when I was an undergraduate at Columbia University. And Greenberg puts all of the languages in the world, 5,000-6,000 of them, into something like a dozen superfamilies. Not everybody agrees with this classification, but Greenberg has a very serious reputation of being right against classifications. So here you see, of course, that Africa being kind of the homeland, you have the greatest diversity. You have Khoisan, Niger Cordofanian, this yellow Nilo-Saharan, and Afro-Asiatic, with Afro-Asiatic including Arabic, Hebrew, and so on, going into Asian. I'll also just point out that Greenberg reconstructed a very large family called Eurasiatic, which includes Indo-European, which itself is a very large family, as well as other families. And Eurasiatic, as you see, is colored blue, and it stretches all over the world. He also reconstructs a family called Bene Caucasian. Bene Caucasian is in this bright red. It includes almost all of the languages spoken in China and a lot of the languages spoken in North America. And he also has a family called Amerind, which covers both Americas, especially South America, before in the pre-Columbus days. So with that kind of classification, Greenberg says there are essentially three waves of migration coming into the Americas. The earliest, by far the largest wave, is the Amerind, a family called Amerind. All of the languages of South America, the indigenous languages of South America, according to Greenberg, and many in North America are Amerind. Then there's a second wave called Bene Caucasian, including much of Alaska, Canada, and even southwestern United States, like New Mexico, Arizona, over there. And only the last latecomers into the Americas, the Eskimo Aleut, who were Eurasiatic. It's difficult to defend this in a few words, but here are some references that argue this type of classification. The most important one is the one published by Greenberg himself, 1987, called Language in the Americas. And a few years later, he and a student of his, Merritt Rowland, wrote a paper for the Scientific American called Linguistic Origins of Native Americans. And here's an example of the type of evidence that they use. Okay. Apparently there are three words that you find in many, many Native American languages. The words are Tina, Tuna, Tana. In some languages, Tina means son, Tuna means daughter. In some other languages, it means child. After all, it's been thousands of years. But they claim to have found this preserved across the thousands of years. So here's the language family. Here are the actual languages. Nootka, Totonac, Miskito, Aymara, so on. And here are the forms, and here are their meanings. This is just part of the data that they present in that article in the Scientific American. So let's go back to the brain. For a variety of reasons, mostly religious, it was not possible to study the brain by dissection. So it was very unusual that this man, Andreas Vesalius, was able to actually dissect many brains and reproduce beautiful anatomical drawings of them as early as the 16th century. Vesalius was a contemporary of Leonardo da Vinci. Da Vinci himself drew some pictures of the brain. But trying to relate the brain to language actually started with this French scientist, Paul Broca. A patient came to see Broca, that's known in the literature as Monsieur Tan, spelled T-A-N. And the reason he was referred this way is because he had essentially one syllable that he could say. Tan, 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 Tan. Everything was called Tan. And after Mr. Tan died, Broca examined his brain and made records. And a few years after Mr. Tan, another man came with very, very similar disabilities. And after this, he died. Broca again did the dissection. And he saw that they had the same symptoms, the same brain damage. He was confident enough to write his first paper on this. And this paper was published in 1861. New observations of aphémie would be the French, what we would say aphasia in English, okay? Produced by a lesion in the posterior part of the second and third convolution of the left frontal lobe. This is a foundational paper. It ushered in a new field. In that paper, this is a passage translated by a friend of mine, Nina Dronkers. Okay. So the integrity of the third frontal convolution, and perhaps of the second, seems indispensable to the exercise of the faculty of articulate language. I found that in my second patient, the lesion occupied exactly the same seat as the first. One was Monsieur Leblanc, the other was Monsieur Leblanc, with exactly the same type of impairment, immediately behind the middle third, opposite the insula, and precisely at the same side, namely the left side. So from this, we now call that region called Broca's area. But is language that localized? Broca was very farsighted. He's an amazing scientist. He knew that at his time, he didn't know enough about the brain to start cutting it apart. He observed the damages and then very carefully preserved those two brains in formaldehyde for later examination. And Nina Dronkers did exactly that. A few years ago, she and her team went to Paris, took out those brains, and did magnetic resonance imaging of those brains. So this is their paper published in Brain. Paul Broca's historic cases, high resolution MRI of the brains of Leblanc and Leblanc. So surely this was the easiest thing to see. Left hemisphere, frontal lobe. Left hemisphere, frontal lobe. But the thing is, with MRI, you can look inside and you can see that the damage is actually a lot more extensive. Okay. I don't want to take the time to read all of the anatomical details now, but the point that I want to make is that any simplification of wanting to localize language to a very small circumscribed area of the brain is doomed to fail. Language is probably a lot more whole brain activity than people in the 19th century recognized. So following Broca came Wernicke. Broca's discovery was in the frontal lobe. Wernicke's discovery was in the temporal lobe. Okay? And Wernicke's aphasics are very, very different from Broca's aphasics. Broca's aphasics can hardly talk. No intonation, no grammar, very limited vocabulary, difficulty in articulation. Wernicke's aphasic, on the other hand, if you hear a bunch of Wernicke's aphasics conversing in the next room, you'd think they're perfectly normal. Fluent speech, good intonation, and so on, except often it's semantically nonsense. Here's an example of Wernicke's aphasia in Psychological Review, published in 2001. It just suddenly had a effort, and all the effort had gone with it. It even stepped my horn. They took them from Earth, They made my favorite 9 to 7, and now I'm being paid by the stamp of Portland on my annulment, which is now forever. Makes no sense at all. Many of these things, to try to look up in a dictionary, it's not there. And yet, the morphology, the syntax, the information is all there. So Broca, Wernicke discovered different functions with different loci in the brain. And a third pioneer of the 19th century was a French friend called Desjardins. Okay? And in 1892, he published this landmark paper about dyslexia. Okay? So Broca and Wernicke dealt with spoken language. Desjardins was the first to see damage in the written language. Oscar C., a retired businessman who had no problem recognizing people, recognizing objects, who has suddenly become unable to read. Here is a description of Oscar C.'s situation included in Desjardins' report. So Desjardins said, asked to read an eye chart, she is unable to name any letter. You stand there, you say E, and the successive rows show smaller and smaller letters. He can't read that at all. However, he claims to see them perfectly. He instinctively sketches the form of the letters with his hand, but is nonetheless unable to say any of the names. He compares the A's to an easel, the Z to a serpent, the P to a buckle. So it's clear he's noticing the shapes. His incapacity to express himself frightens him. He thinks he's gone mad, since he's well aware that the signs that he cannot name are letters. So these are the early pioneers. A linguist was able to see the importance of aphasia for linguistics. So one of my heroes, a Russian linguist called Roman Jakobson. Jakobson made his reputation early in historical linguistics, publishing this article in French. And in 1941, this is a truly insightful monograph in which he tries to put together Kindersprache, Aphasie und allgemein Lautgesetze. Children's speech, aphasia, and sound laws, general sound laws. Three seemingly completed, unrelated areas. He was the first to put them together. And after he came to the United States, he co-authored with two people, Gunnar Wang, very, very eminent Swedish engineer, Morris Halle, and wrote this book, Preliminaries to Speech Analysis, which is a classic in linguistics. I have a very vivid memory of Roman Jakobson. He came to the University of Michigan to lecture, and I was a graduate student then, and I have very poignant recollection. The band came out, the director of the Linguistic Institute came out and introduced it. He says, "Ladies and gentlemen, it's my honor to present to you the greatest linguist in the world, Roman Jakobson." And he says, "The only man in the world who can speak 12 languages fluently, all in Russian." As soon as Dr. Jakobson started to lecture, I knew what he meant. The Russian accent was extremely pronounced. But as you can see, he wrote beautifully in French, wrote beautifully in German, in English, in Norwegian, in Czech. He was truly a master of many, many languages, but not their phonologies. So we talked about aphasia, and Jakobson says, let's also try to relate this to child language. What is child language like? Well, we know, of course, in the womb, there's a lot of important developments taking place. And one recent study says that the peripheral auditory system is mature by 26 weeks of gestation. And the properties of the womb are such that the majority of low-frequency sounds, less than 300 hertz, are transmitted to the fetal inner ear. And goes into rather great detail here on what the fetus at 26 weeks can or cannot hear. And interestingly, this is reflected perhaps in the first infant cries. This is a paper that was published in Current Biology a few years ago by Mampe together with Angela Frederici. And here you have the spectrogram as well as the sound wave of a typical French infant cry. Notice the rising pitch and the increasing amplitude. And this is compared with a typical German infant cry. Notice the falling pitch and a decreasing amplitude. And this is based on 30 French infants and 30 German infants. Namely, as opposed to right? And where's the stress in French? At the end. Linguistique. Where's the stress in German? Initially. Sprachwissenschaft. So these people claim that the fetal impressions of the voices in the neighbor ambient environment actually gets reflected in the cries. I would like to see, some replications of this or further elaboration on this. I was very intrigued by this paper. This is another classic paper showing us what infants are capable of right at birth. Andrew Meltzoff had published this in 1977. This observation, on the other hand, has been replicated, observed, elaborated upon in many other laboratories. So this is certainly a valid observation. That infants, even before their vision gets correctly focused, before they have any idea what their face looks like, are able to imitate anybody who sticks his head over the crib. What is the genetic basis of this? What genes manufactured what kind of neural circuits that allows neonates, just born infants, to do this? All sorts of fascinating questions. So here we see the infant at birth, about 300 grams, so 300 cc's in volume, going up. And around puberty age, it settles down to about 1400 cc's. And linguists have many times observed that there seems to be a critical age, critical number of years during which language comes very easily, effortlessly. And one of the people who started this observation on a neurological basis was a Canadian neurosurgeon called Wang. And back in 1939, Penfield said, before the age of 9 to 12, a child is a specialist in learning to speak. At that age, he can learn 2 or 3 languages as easily as 1. And for the purposes of learning languages, the human brain becomes progressively stiff and rigid after age 9. Okay. I don't think it's quite that rigid, but there's certainly a maturational aspect to language learning. Penfield made other better known contributions. It was a neurosurgeon, and it's mostly people with epilepsy came to his hospital. He would open up the brain and essentially to remove the portion of the nervous system that's causing the epilepsy. But he took advantage of these opportunities Raphael this morning was talking about somebody, a neurosurgeon, maybe taking advantage of these clinical situations to study language. Ed Chang, right? Ed Chang in San Francisco. Well, Penfield did this very early, and he did this with especially using electrical stimulation. He would touch the cortex, exposed cortex, with an electrode and look at the effects. And it's because of this type of work he was able to come up with a very nice definition of which portion of the cortex is representing which part of the body. So here, for instance, is the sensory cortex, which is the major gyrus, the first major gyrus on the parietal lobe. And here's the motor cortex. Oh, thank you. Is it noticeable? I guess I'm getting hoarse. I'm just about done. Thanks very much. I guess I'm running out of time too. Well, I'll have maybe 4 or 5 more slides. Yeah. Okay. The thing that interests me about these pictures is that the body is represented upside down. The mouth, the head, and so on are down here. The ankle, the foot, the leg, and so on are down here. That's one thing that's very obvious. Another thing that's obvious is that it's not the size of the body part
is the amount of nervous control you have over that body part. So, for instance, the back of the body has very little representation here. On the other hand, something like the tongue, okay? Something like the tongue has a relative, or something like the face has a relatively large representation. We've been recently trying to see whether we can hook up a set of electrodes to the head and detect brain waves to control a computer, BCI, brain-computer interface. And one thing that we're very intrigued with is whether different portions of the motor cortex, which are involved in producing different sounds, can be monitored in such a way that without actually having the muscular ability to produce those sounds, can nevertheless say those things via brainwaves. So far it's been an uphill battle, but this is the diagram that gave us the idea. These show various other things. I was going to talk a little bit about brain imaging, and very, very young infants actually know a lot about language and speech perception. It's going to tell you a little bit about my own lab. I hope you can visit. Here's, for instance, a typical sample of EEG data. It's going to tell you that data at first looks really messy, but because we do trial and trial and trial and trial and trial, if we average it, after a while, it becomes a lot more systematic because the noise kind of gets averaged downward, the signal gets averaged upward, and that gives us an event-related potential. That's the basic idea of EEG studies in many language studies. And this is averaging across subjects. I'll leave the PowerPoint with you if anybody's interested. We also did something about Chinese writing system, because in Hong Kong and on the mainland of China, the writing systems are different. And we wanted to know whether the different writing systems will result in different brainwaves by using non-characters. It's like nonsense syllables. These do not exist. But I think I better just quit now. I'll just say a few last words. Okay, going back to Jakobson, and I'm impressed by these remarks he made. He said the nature of these problems calls for coordinated research by linguists, psychologists, experts in the physiology of speech and hearing, physicists, communications and electronic engineers, mathematicians, students, mainly everybody. So, language did not emerge in a sudden miracle in any so-called organ, instinct, or bioprogram. It's the product of millions of years of biological evolution, accelerated by complementary cultural evolution. Since the emergence of our genus Homo, major phase transitions in its evolutionary trajectory include bipedal posture, symbolization, segmental phonology, and the invention of writing. And each of these associated with developments in the structure and function of the brain. Since language touches intimately upon so many aspects of our lives, the study of language presents challenges, not just to linguists, but also to many areas of biology, notably genetics, cognitive neuroscience and psychology, as well as to many areas of computational engineering and social sciences. And here I'm kind of echoing Jacobson there. Only with a close, multidisciplinary collaboration of interested experts from all these areas will we be able to eventually achieve a deep understanding of what language is, a behavior that makes our species unique in the entire known universe since life itself began.